9 a.m. I am Deepak here, and my life is beautiful and stay on top of it because of work as worship. Back to Fit Spirit for a long gap of 2 weeks, and here we are back. The one very common term that we use usually in parenting. I thought I'll discuss about that today. A lot of people have this thing called generation gap. They say almost a gap of 25-30 years between the parent and the children. So there's supposed to be a generation gap. And very conveniently, all of us have agreed for it, which I think is stupid. There's nothing called generation gap. If that logic applies, that because parents and children, there's a gap of around 20 to 30 years, the huge gap of generation is there of 25-30 years, then the grandparents and grandchildren should have almost of 60 years of generation gap. But have you noticed or observed? Actually, grandchildren are very close to grandparents, and grandparents are very close to grandchildren. The kind of bonding I have seen with most of the grandparents and grandchildren is phenomenal. In fact, grandchildren are more closer to grandparents, and grandparents are more closer to grandchildren. So if the logic of generation gap applies, that because parents and children have a gap of 20, 25, 30 years, then grandparents should be way far away somewhere from the grandchildren, and so is the truth with grandchildren. But most of the times you will see most of the children are very close to their grandparents. Why? The logic fails. My dear friends, there is nothing called generation gap. There is purely, it's called as communication gap. Because parents are busy. Reasonable, unreasonable, valid, invalid, valid justifications. But the truth is, parents, because of their commitments, work commitments, family commitments, social commitments, hardly get time with the children on a daily basis. Whereas, because grandparents are almost retired and they don't have much of outside commitment beyond family, they spend a lot of time with children, grandchildren. And grandchildren also gets a lot of attention from the grandparents, so they share almost everything with the grandparents. And grandparents have so many stories to tell, real stories, book stories, stories from mythologies, and 100 more things. The experience of 55, 60, 70 years. So everything is shared with the little ones. And they give attention, they give significance, and same is true. The reciprocation happens. Grandchildren also are very close. They come and talk, share everything because they want to talk, and parents don't have that time. Grandparents had a gap with their children, and now their children who have children, they have gap among them. The reason is not about generation gap. The reason is all about communication gap. If parents also speak as frequently, regularly with their children and allow them to speak, then they only giving them knowledge, gyan, and all the time lectures, where children become block. If there is a reciprocation from each side, and if parents allow the children to speak, share, talk it out, vent it out without judgment, I think there is not going to be any communication gap. And when there is no communication gap, there can't be any kind of gap. What is the generation gap then? There can be a. I have seen so many parents who are as trendy as their children, and I also know there are so many children who are as traditional and cultured. When I say cultured, basically talking about the family tradition, what they follow, are as cultured and traditional as the parents are. The reason is not about generation gap. The reason is purely of communication gap. I had that block, I think 7 years ago, that I cannot relate with young crowd or teenagers and this and that. And I used to always, so I had never taken program for teenagers because I think they have tremendous amount of attitude. There is a different kind of rebelliousness and unwanted arrogance, and I can't deal with all this thing. Maybe my ego didn't permit, or I may not be, I was not prepared well enough to work with the teenagers. So I never, in fact, all people who are working with me, they should take the program for teenagers. Conspiracy of life, I ended up opening a college, the Kingdom College, and I now only work with the teenagers, and I realized today the way I relate with them, the way I gel with them, I am 52 and they are almost like 16, 17, 18, that age bracket they are with me, and not one or two, hundreds of them. I relate with them on a daily basis, and I see no gap between both of us. They are equally willing to share openly. I am willing to go to their level and talk and discuss 100 things, and they are so close with me. In fact, they are much more closer to me than any other relationship which is very close to, supposed to be close to them. Then I realized there is nothing called generation gap. Then I should be actually away from my college boys and girls. In fact, they want so much to be close with me. They want to be always around me. I also want to be with them all the time. The reason is what? The reason is very, very plain and simple. There's a lot of communication that happens between me and the students. Communication of almost every aspect, from their life, from my life, their growth, their failures, their tensions, their worries, their issues, how I have dealt with. There is so much of communication happening on a regular basis, and there is no gap. So if we go with this term called generation gap, then I think it's not fair. It's purely that parents have not taken up the responsibility, or they don't understand, or they never understood that the only way to build relationship is by investment of time, communication and emotion, which grandparents very happily did because they had all the time. And grandparents miss their children, and their children are going to miss their children, and this set of children will miss their children. If we don't understand this, there is nothing called generation gap. There's purely communication gap. I've seen so many people where the age gap is so huge. There's a gap of 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, and they feel very close to each other. I have known for uncles and nephews together. I have known for mama bhanja, chacha bhatrija. They are so close to each other. So where is the generation gap here? This generation gap term is not real. It is just for our convenience. We have given some name to vent out that feeling that nobody understands me, or they don't understand me, or they don't understand us because there is generation gap. There is nothing called generation gap. So many people relate so nicely with Narendra Modi. So many youngsters relate with Narendra Modi. So many sports people relate with Narendra Modi. Why? He chose to communicate. He communicates to almost every age bracket. Today I have students, today I have an age bracket from the age of 2 years, where in the preschools when I go of mine, the way they relate with me, the way they like me, the way they love me, express me is phenomenal. From 2 years to 70 to 75 years is the age bracket where I work, where I relate with, and I don't see any kind of generation gap. It's purely communication gap. If you are willing to invest time, communication and emotion on any age bracket, you will not see a difference between any age bracket. There's nothing called generation gap. It's purely communication gap. With that understanding, let's start this beautiful, wonderful week together. Here we go. So guys, go get set and grow. Stay on top of